Welcome to CrimePod Castle. I'm so glad you could join us for the 11th episode of Ghosts of the Past. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into a case that's truly chilling. The Bhagalpur Blindings in India back in 1980 and 81.
It's a dark period for sure. One that makes us face some hard truths about justice, power, and what people can endure.
It's hard to believe something so awful could happen. Over 30 men, their lives changed forever by this brutal act, all in the name of justice.
That's exactly why we need to understand it. We're not just revisiting a terrible event, we're looking at how things went wrong in the system, what pressures were at play, and how power made this possible.
Okay, let's set the scene then. Bhagalpur, a city in Bihar, India, in the late 70s, early 80s. Can you give our listeners a picture of what it was like there?
Imagine a place struggling with poverty, crime everywhere, and people already distrusting the police and courts. The police were under pressure to get results, but the courts were jammed, and cases took years to finish.
It sounds like a recipe for desperation
Hmm.
on everyone's part. So how did this lead to what happened?
Well, keep in mind, people were demanding quick justice. They felt let down by the slow legal system. And the police, feeling the pressure, chose a shortcut.
A shortcut that involved blinding people they suspected of crimes. It's hard to grasp that anyone would see that as a solution.
It is, but sadly, that's what happened. They believed that by being this brutal, they'd not only deal with the suspects they had, but also stop future crime.
So they basically became judge, jury, and executioner, only the execution was a slow and painful loss of sight.
Exactly. And we need to be clear about how they did it. Acid poured into eyes, needles dipped in acid and stabbed into eyeballs. This wasn't some clean medical procedure, it was torture.
It's difficult to even hear about. Can you imagine the fear those men must have felt?
And the worst part, a lot of the victims were accused of petty theft, small stuff. Some were even grabbed without any evidence at all.
So it's not just that the punishment was barbaric. It was often random, with no regard for due process, basic human dignity.
That's right. The police did as they pleased, deciding who deserved to be blinded, often based on nothing much or just because they fit a certain type.
It's heartbreaking the thought that these men went through this terrible cruelty and then were left to deal with the aftermath. What happened to them after they were blinded?
Imagine suddenly living in a world of darkness. These men, a lot of them already poor and struggling, now had a whole new level of vulnerability. They're pushed aside by their communities, couldn't work, often had to beg to survive.
Punished twice, it sounds like, first by the police, then by society. How did they cope with this sudden, horrific change?
It's a testament to people's strength that many adapted and survived. Some families rallied around their loved ones, giving care and support. Others formed little communities, those blinded sharing their experiences, helping each other through this new reality.
And inspiring to hear about their resilience. But it makes you wonder, how did this awful practice finally stop? Someone had to speak up, right?
At first, fear kept a lot of people quiet. Can you imagine? Living where the police could, without warning, take your sight forever. But eventually, the truth started to get out.
And who were the brave ones who dared to expose what was happening?
Investigative journalists were key. They went to Bhagalpur, interviewed victims, got their stories, and published photos that shocked the whole nation.
It's the power of storytelling, isn't it? Giving a voice to those who had none, making people face a truth they didn't want to see.
You got it. These journalists shed light on the darkness. Their work sparked outrage and demands for people to be held responsible. Soon, human rights activists joined in, amplifying the victims' voices, putting pressure on the government to act.
So this local atrocity became a national scandal.
Mm-hmm.
How did the authorities react? Did they deny it?
Well, at first they tried to downplay it. Some officials even tried to justify the blinding, saying crime was so bad it was necessary.
Essentially blaming the victims.
Kind of, yeah. But as public anger grew, fueled by the media and the activists, those justifications fell apart. The government couldn't ignore what had happened in Bhagalpur anymore.
And this is where the Supreme Court of India comes in, right? I read about this. They took a very unusual step.
They did. The Supreme Court saw how serious it was, this blatant human rights violation, and decided to intervene on their own, something called suo motu cognizance. They didn't wait for a formal complaint. They took direct action.
That's significant, right? Shows how seriously they were taking this.
Absolutely. And that opened the floodgates. Petitions came pouring in from all over the country. Victims, human rights groups, lawyers, all demanding justice for these men.
So for the first time, these men, many illiterate, not understanding the legal system, their voices were heard on a national stage.
Exactly. The Supreme Court gave them a platform to share their stories, their pain, their demand for accountability, a turning point in the fight for justice.
Let's talk about the legal consequences then. Were those officers and officials held accountable for their actions?
Well, the Supreme Court ordered a full investigation, and that led to some real consequences. Police and prison officials were suspended, arrested, even charged with crimes.
That has to be some kind of victory, knowing those responsible didn't just get away with it.
It was. But the road to justice isn't always easy, especially for those already pushed to the margins without power.
So, even with the highest court involved, justice wasn't easy for these victims.
No, not at all. A lot of them faced huge obstacles trying to work the legal system. Remember, many were poor, couldn't read, and were already deeply traumatized. Imagine fighting for your rights like that against a system that had already failed you so badly.
It must have felt like an uphill battle the whole way.
Absolutely. And while some did eventually get compensation, it was often delayed, not enough. No amount of money could truly fix what they'd been through physically and emotionally.
A reminder that real justice isn't just about punishment or payouts. It's about restoring someone's dignity, acknowledging their suffering, and making sure such awful things never happen again.
Right. And in that sense, the Bhagalpur Blindings did make a lasting impact. The Supreme Court, even while giving some victims temporary relief, set a precedent. It was one of the first times the Indian courts clearly said the state is responsible when human rights are violated.
So despite the outcome not being perfect for each victim, this case became a turning point in the fight for human rights in India.
For sure. It forced the whole nation to confront police brutality and the need for change. It showed how important a free press is and how vital it is for people to keep watch and hold those in power accountable.
It's like this horrific act, in a strange way, became a trigger for positive change.
You could say that. The Bhagalpur Blindings became a symbol, a call for justice and police reform. It exposed the danger of power without checks, how fragile due process is, and the need for a legal system that's more open and accountable.
It's something that still resonates today, reminding us to be vigilant about protecting human rights.
It does. And while the scars of what happened remain, this case also shows us how resilient people can be, how they keep seeking justice, even when it seems impossible.
This deep dive into the Bhagalpur Blindings has been a chilling look at what can happen when power is misused and how delicate justice can be. But it also shows the bravery of those who spoke out, fought for change, and in the end, helped reshape India's legal system.
It's a story that makes us face hard truths, look at our own systems, and never take our rights for granted.
For our listeners, what's the one thing you'd want them to remember from this?
I'd say, never think your voice doesn't matter. Never be afraid to speak up against injustice, to demand those responsible are held accountable, and to fight for what's right. Even small acts of courage can make a difference and contribute to a bigger movement for change.
Thank you for sharing your insights with us on this truly disturbing case. It's a story that needs to be told, a lesson we can't forget.
Absolutely. The Bhagalpur Blindings, though a terrible part of India's history, also show us the power of the human spirit and the constant pursuit of justice.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey into the dark side of history. We encourage you to dig deeper, do your own research, and keep the conversation going about justice, human rights, and the role we all play in building a better world. Remember, history can repeat itself if we don't learn from it. Let's honor the victims of Bhagalpur by striving for a future where such horrors never happen again. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to CrimePod Castle for more stories of resilience, courage, and truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.